A cloudless June sky above, a dusty California mountain road, and a young tenderfoot from Ohio mounted a stout poncho with an outfit casting of a roll of blankets and a six-shooter. Fired with visions of suddenly acquired wealth, I had a few weeks before starting for California, sorely against the wishes of my parents and advice of my friends. I was riding slowly up the long mountain grade, headed for the gravel mines of the North Fork of the Yuba, and calculated to make the mountain house by dark, when I was overtaken by a horseman who rode up beside me with a genial, "How are you, stranger?" He was a fine-looking man of about 30, with a blond beard, and the handsome horse he bestowed was somewhat jaded. We rode on together up the grade and fell into conversation. He inquired where I was from and where I was bound for, both of which questions I answered frankly. He told me that he was a mine owner over on the Middle Fork, and that he had just made a business trip down the ridge, and I was in a hurry to get back, and added that I had better come on with him and he would give me a job. I gratefully accepted his offer, and when we stopped to water about halfway up the grade, he asked me to carry a small pair of saddlebags, as his horse was pretty well beat out. I complied cheerfully, as my beast was comparatively fresh. The bags were heavy, and he remarked, as he had handed them over, that they contained the coin from his last cleanup. With a due appreciation of the importance of the trust, I felt for my six-shooter, and we pushed on up the grade. Arrived at the top, he took a crossroad, remarking that he had guessed he could make it to Old Man Brown's by night. I found him a pleasant, entertaining fellow, and being no doubt conceited, imagined that he found me the same. It was nearly dark when we rode up to a low, rambling old building where he designated as Old Man Brown's, and added that it was rather a hard place, but any port in a storm was welcome. As we rode up to the porch of a slender girl of about 14 with big brown eyes and a shock of red curls came running around the corner of the house. She looked as wild as a deer, and my first thought was, what a beauty she will make some day. I raised my sombrero and asked if we could get accommodations for the night. "Don't know. I'll go ask Dad," she said shortly, and darted into the house through the bar room. A moment later, a portly old man in lisp slippers made his appearance, rubbing his hands and smiling benignly. "How are you, boys? Want to stop?" "All right. Here, Jess, call Joe to take the horses." I had just dismounted and started to remove the saddlebags when a glance at my traveling companion checked me. He was gazing back down the road and listening intently. I saw a grayish pallor overspread his face. The next moment he struck spurs into his horse and without a word galloped up the road in the opposite direction. Surprised and alarmed, I sprang again into the saddle, and as the sound of horses approaching at a rapid rate came to my ears, I started up the road after my companion. My first thought was that highwaymen were on the track. Glancing back, I saw a number of horsemen riding furiously down upon me. I heard loud oaths and orders to halt. Without heeding them, I spurred on and drew my six-shooter, determined to sell my life as dearly as possible. The next moment, a volley rang out, and my horse stumbled and fell. Before I could rise, I was surrounded by the roughest-looking crowd of men it had ever been my misfortune to encounter. Cries of, "Kill him! Shoot him! Hang him!" were heard, and a dozen hands seized me in no gentle grasp. My horse lay dead. One of the men thrust his hand into the saddlebags and pulled out a sack of coin. "Here you are, boys. Here's the swag. Hang the blanket thief," he shouted. "Let's take them over to Brown's and hear what he's got to say," said the tall man who seemed to be the leader. This proposition met with general disfavor, especially from an officious man who took a rawhide lariat from his saddle and, leading the way to a spreading oak tree that stood near, exclaimed, "Here's a good limb. Fetch him along, boys." But the tall man demurred and had his way. If he hadn't given an account of himself, we'll make short work of him. I attempted to explain, but a pistol was held at my head, with the peremptory command to shut up, so I shut. My arms were then bound with the lariat. I was marched back to Brown's and placed in one corner of the bar room. The girl Jess stood in the door looking at me curiously, and I thought rather pityingly. My trial then began. It was brief and to the point. The stage had been robbed the day before, the express messenger killed, and several $1,000s stolen. The robbers, supposed to be 2 in number, had escaped, and these men had organized a party to hunt them down, had tracked them thus far, and succeeded in capturing me with part of the stolen money in my possession. Brown testified to our riding up a few minutes before they came and asking leave to stop overnight, and adding, with a solemn shake of his head, that they had let the worst one get away. They then demanded to know what I had to say, and I told my story in as straightforward a manner as possible. It was listened to incredulously by most of them, but among a few I thought I saw looks that encouraged me, and I wound up with an appeal for my life which I felt most touched them. I was doomed to bitter disappointment when the lank man who had been so officiously anxious to hang me at once arose, and, after expectorating remarks with a harsh laugh, "Young feller, you can't come it over us that-a-way. Come on, boys, let's string him up." Several rose, and with oaths loud and deep seconded the motion. My blood ran cold as I realized my imminent peril. These rough miners, who certainly had strong circumstantial evidence against me, felt perfectly justified in hanging me to the nearest tree. What could I do? I gazed from one to the other like a hunted animal. "Surely you would not hang a man on such evidence as this," I cried. "If you will untie me, I can show you letters that prove who I am." The tall man, whom they called Joe, stepped up and untied me. I drew out a letter from my mother which I had received while in San Francisco. It contained a card photograph of my pretty sister Alice, which fell to the floor as I drew out the letter. Joe picked it up. "It's my sister's picture," I cried. "Here, read the letter, any of you. It will prove that I am an honest man." Joe was gazing earnestly at the picture. "Tell you what, boys, this here's a little beauty. In my heart, I blessed her pretty face and only wished her there to be a plead for me in person." The picture was passed around, and hope sprang up in my heart when the old Missourian, who claimed Thurston for my gore, dashed it down again by exclaiming, "How do ye know what he stole that letter and picture from someone on the stage or out of the mail bag? It's all bosh. Let's hang him and be done with it." Joe took the photo again and glanced from it to me. "Now looky here, Mizzo. Seems to me you're a getting there cold-blooded in your old age. Anybody with half an eye can see that this gal's looks like him." I thanked God for the resemblance, which was slight, and began to hope again. The girl Jess crowded in among the men and asked to see the picture. Joe handed it to her, jocosely remarking that he'd marry her when she got to be handsome as that. She quietly replied, "Shut your mouth," and gazed intently on the picture. "I'll bet that's his sister," she said presently. "I'm inclined to think so myself," said Joe. "I think we'd better wait, boys, and take him down to the bar." At this, there was a dissenting murmur, which grew so strong that my courage failed again. Suddenly, Joe turned to the crowd and cried, "Tell you what, boys, let's lay it on to luck. I'll play him a straight game of freeze-out. If he loses, he's our meat. What do you say?" The idea seemed to tickle the fancy of the crowd. They evidently had evidence in Joe's ability to play poker. Unfortunately for me, it was a game of which I knew nothing, and I told them so. The girl, Jess, was still standing beside Joe. "Let me play for him," she said eagerly. "Luck's always with me." "Yes, let's play," cried the men, evidently amused at the novelty of the thing, and also sure that Joe's superior skill would win. "Let Jess play for him. Can you stake her, young feller?" I looked at the girl curiously. Her big eyes were glittering with excitement, but she was cool and self-possessed. Taking out my purse, which contained my wealth, about $100, I handed it to her. The cards were produced, and in a few moments she and Joe were seated opposite each other, and the game began. It was a weird scene, and I had only the odd feeling that I was simply a spectator and in no way concerned. I remember wishing for sketching materials that I might transfer it to canvas. What a picture it would make! The low-ceilinged, uninviting room, the smoky lamps shedding a flickering light upon the eager group round the table. I could see the face of the young girl and knew that in all probability my life hung upon her luck. She played in silence, except to indicate how many cards she wanted to draw. It was an even game for a while, then Joe began to win, and her pile of coins gradually diminished. She played coolly on, despite the comments of the crowd, was down to her last dollar when the tide turned in her favor. She won steadily, raking in the coin each time till Joe was nearly broke. He began to bet cautiously, having evidently no desire to be beaten by a girl. I watched her face closely for some sign of excitement, but none was visible. She was thoroughly self-possessed, and in fact, that she had held my life in her hands had no outward effect upon her. Luck turned in Joe's favor again, and they were soon about even. The crowd grew impatient. "What are you afraid of, Joe? Where are your nerve? Why don't you bet?" And like expressions were heard, while others encouraged the girl. Old Man Brown came around and patted her on the shoulder, remarking that Jess always did have a doggone best luck, and it was Joe's deal. Jess opened it for $10 and discarded 2. Joe also discarded 2, and after a draw, gave a short laugh and raised her 10. She glanced at her coin in an uncertain way, then at her hand. She had $3 less than he. The excitement was intense. For a moment, only the heavy breathing could be heard. Then Jess laughed a little and pushed her last dollar into the pot. Old Mizzou broke into a discordant laugh. "Jess, don't bluff worth a damn," he cried. Joe calmly pushed in the rest of his money. "It'll be make or break this time," he said, glancing over at me. "Sorry for you, young fella. Boys, get your rope. What do you got, Jess?" She quietly laid down 4 9s and the jack of hearts. He held 3 aces and a pair of 8s. He struck the table a blow that made the money jingle. "Good girl. Luck's on your side. I'd have staked my last cent on that hand, but 4s are too much for me. Come on, boys. Let's irrigate." He led the way to the bar, followed by a crowd now seemingly in the best of humors. Jess calmly raked in the pot, put the money in my purse, and handed it to me, remarking laconically, "Here, you'd better take this and get." "I don't want it at all," I exclaimed. "Only what I put in." "Keep it all. It's yours. They've killed your horse." And before I could say anything more, she left the room. My first impulse was to put as much distance as possible between myself and the crowd, but on second thoughts, I reflected that there was no other house within several miles, that I knew nothing of this country, and I started out on foot. I was liable to be run down by another gang of robbers. Therefore, I put on a bold front and asked Brown to give me a lodging for the night. He picked up a guttering candle, called Jess, and told her to show me to the corral. This was a big loft over the bar room in which were a dozen or more uninviting-looking beds. She placed the candle on a box beside one of these and was about to leave the room when I detained her. "Miss Jessie, I have not yet thanked you for what you have done for me tonight. Is there nothing I can do to show my gratitude?" She laughed in an embarrassed manner. "Why, it wasn't anything. I like to play. I'd done it for anybody. I'm sure of that, but is there nothing I can do for you?" She hesitated for a moment. "Would you mind giving me that picture?" "What? My sister's?" "No, indeed. You can have it, and welcome. She is one of the sweetest girls on earth, and would be only too glad to do what she could for anyone who is kind to me." She took it and thanked me. I thought I'd like to look at it. I'm much obliged. Good night. I did not see her about the house next morning. All the participants in the wished-for necktie party of the night before had vanished. I saw nothing of the saddlebags, so concluded they had taken them. I inquired for Miss Jessie and was told that she had gone off early to drive up some cattle on the divide. The Chinese cook provided me with a scanty breakfast, and when the stage came by, I mounted it with a feeling of inexpressible relief. Half an hour later, as we rounded a curve in the road, we came face to face with Jess. She was mounted on a vicious-looking black Mustang and galloped rapidly past, her bright curls streaming in the wind. I had only time to raise my hat in response to a smile of recognition when she passed, I then thought, out of my life forever. I had been in the mines but a short time when I received the sad news of my father's death, accompanied by an urgent request from my mother that I return home at once and take charge of his business affairs. This was incumbent upon me as I was the only son. So within 3 months of time of my arrival in California, I was again at home, my gold hunting fever slightly abated, but still hoping to return to the Pacific coast. But circumstances combined to prevent it. Alice welcomed me with open arms. She was intensely interested in my California experience and wished very much to write to Jessie and thank her for liberating me from my dangerous situation. But as I did not know her address, she had to abandon the idea. She died the second year after I had returned, leaving only my mother and myself, as she was averse to leaving the old house. I remained there until her death some 12 years later. Then, finding life intolerably monotonous, I arranged my business, in which I had been successful, so that I could leave for an indefinite time. I felt a strong desire to revisit the scenes of my early California experience, and in due time found myself at City. I decided to make the mountain trip on horseback as of yore, so hired a good horse, and one bright June morning started again over the almost forgotten mountain grades. About 2 o'clock, I overtook a heavily laden wagon drawn by 6 powerful horses. The sun's rays were uncomfortably warm. The road was dusty. Just ahead was the watering trough where the strangers overtook me so long ago. The driver of the team ahead was a stalwart 6-footer. He wore a blond beard and a slouch hat and walked beside the wheelers. He had a black snake whip looped around his shoulders and every now and then spoke encouragingly to the straining animals. As we reached the trough, I drew rein beside him. He eased the horses back from a heavy pull and answered my salutation pleasantly. Something in the man's face struck me as familiar. He watered his team, then produced a flask and invited me to smile with him. I returned the compliment with a cigar, and we entered into conversation. I inquired if he knew what had become of the old man Brown, who kept a stooping place over on the divide years ago. He looked at me keenly a moment. Oh yes, the old buzzard kicked the bucket some time ago, struck a good mine and couldn't stand prosperity. What's become of the girl? Blanked if I know. Took her down to Frisco and put her to school. Seemed to me, I did hear she married Tom Stewart, Brown's old partner, but he'd gone up the flume too, I hear. Old place is gone to rack. Nobody living up there now. Good stopping place, about a mile the other side though. Stand up, Belle. I rode on ahead, no longer puzzled as to where I had met the stalwart driver, for memory straightway carried me back to my acquaintance of 14 years ago, who had so unceremoniously deserted me that memorable night at old man Brown's. He had changed but little, while I, who was but a boy then, was now bearded and bronzed and had no fear of being recognized. I rode on, musing on the ups and downs of life, and presently reached the crossroad. I found the old hostelry a heap of ruins, the roof having been crushed in some previous winter by the weight of snow. After drifting aimlessly round among the mining towns of the Sierras for some weeks, I went to San Francisco. One day, while strolling on the beach by the Cliff House, I came face to face with a beautiful woman who both interested and puzzled me. She was tall and well formed, with fine brown eyes and a heavy coil of dark auburn hair. She was dressed in black plainly, but with much distinction, and had every indication of wealth and refinement. She was accompanied by an elderly woman whom I heard her address as Auntie. I managed to pass and repass them several times and fancied the brown eyes glanced at me rather interestedly. Without being obtrusive, I kept them in sight and returned to the city on the same train. I secured a seat just behind them and devoted myself to studying her very detail and dress and manner. Arrived at the depot, they entered a cab and were driven away, and I returned to the hotel, more interested than I cared to confess. For years I had been so devoted to my mother and to my business that no thought of marriage had seriously entered my mind. Now I suddenly realized that gray hairs were creeping among the black, and if I ever intended to marry, it was high time I gave the matter my attention. How much the thought of a pair of brown eyes had to do with this resolution I cannot say. A week passed without my seeing her again, though I haunted the principal thoroughfares by day and the theaters by night. I was beginning to despair. When in strolling through the conservatory at the Golden Gate Park one day, I again met her, accompanied by the same elderly lady. They were examining some rare orchids. When her eyes met mine, I distinctly saw a pink flush still over her lovely face, and I fancied I saw a smile in the brown eyes, but she bent over a flower, and I passed on, mentally cursing my luck and my inability to obtain an introduction. They soon went out and took a shady seat in the park. I sat down as near as possible without being obtrusive, and, taking out a paper, pretended to read. In reality, I watched her over the top. Presently they arose, and I saw with a thrill of delight that my divinity had left her portemonnaie on the seat. Instantly a spirit of covetousness took possession of me. I must have that purse at all hazards. I immediately appropriated it, and dreading lest I should be seen, strolled into another part of the park, feeling delightedly guilty. Arrived at a place free from observation, I examined my treasure. It contained a $20 gold piece, some silver, and a few cards of memoranda. On one of the cards was written a name and address, Jesse E. Stewart, number 231 Street. I felt elated. I had heard her companion address her as Jessie that day in the conservatory. I determined to wait till the next day, call at that address, and return to the property. In the next morning's paper I saw an advertisement of the lost purse, which I request that I, the founder, would return it to the same address as that on the card and receive reward. I wondered if I should receive the reward. I so much desired an acquaintance with her, and determined to return it that morning. About 10 o'clock, I rang a bell in a pretty cottage in the prettiest resident portion of the city. A neat servant maid answered my ring. I asked for the lady who had advertised a lost purse. "Ah, yes," she said. "Step into the library. We will be down in a moment." She ushered me into a lovely little room and ran upstairs, leaving me staring stupidly at a life-sized portrait of my sister Alice, which hung on the opposite wall. In an instant it all flashed across me. The resemblance to someone I had met puzzled me no longer. I saw, as in a dream, the low-ceiled room in the old house in the Sierras, the rough faces of the miners, the eager eyes of the young girl as she sat there playing for my life. As I gazed at the picture, a light step sounded behind me, and turning, I stood before the woman I had been following for weeks, to find in her the heroine of my early California experience. She laughed musically and held out her hand. "Ah, Mr. Elliot, I see you recognize me through your sister's portrait. Now, my memory is far better than yours, for I remembered you the day I saw you at Cliff House. Have I then changed so very much since that night? Let me see, it was 14 years ago, was it not?" I seized both her hands in an impulsive clasp, though I remembered her as a thin slip of a girl, like a new moon, sure to be rounded into beauty soon. I had no idea she would develop into such a beautiful woman. Changed? Yes, you have changed very much, but it is very strange I did not recognize you. I ought to have done so. There's nothing strange about it. I have changed very much, for the better, I hope. I have had a strange story. Sit down and let me tell it to you. I did so willingly, and she went on. In the first place, I am not old man Brown's daughter. I know nothing of my parents except that both died of yellow fever in New Orleans when I was a baby. Mr. and Mrs. Brown adopted me and brought me to California. They built that house, and I was brought up there with no advantages except to lay up an abundant supply of health. I was as wild as a hawk and almost as fierce, I think. When I was 10 years old, Mother Brown died. After that, I ran completely wild. Father Brown was always good to me, but always let me have my own way to a shocking extent. However, I can say this much. Though thrown with a rough crowd, I was always treated with the utmost respect. I sometimes think they were a trifle afraid of my ungovernable temper. Don't be alarmed. It has been under control for years now. The year after you were there, Father Brown had the luck to strike rich gravel and land that he had owned. He took in a partner, Mr. Stewart, and once brought me down here to put me to school. I became very much attached to one of my teachers, Miss Ross. She is the one with whom you have seen. Father Brown died the year later, and I was put in school, leaving me in care of his partner, Mr. Stewart. When I was old enough to leave school, I had no one home, so Mr. Stewart kindly got me out of the difficulty by marrying me. He was very kind to me, and I missed him greatly when he died. I induced Miss Ross to make her home with me, and she has been with me ever since. I have often thought that I should meet you again. The picture you gave me has been a great comfort to me. When I grew restless and discouraged at school, I always fancied her sweet eyes looking at me reproachfully, and when I had won an unusually hard battle with myself, I seemed to read commendation within them. My heart was almost too full for utterance. Sweet little Alice! How glad she would have been to know that her pictured face had been so precious to a struggling sister. I told her gently of Alice's death shortly after my return home, and how anxious she had been to write to her. Mrs. Stewart was much affected, and to give her time to recover, I related the principal events that had taken place with me since I last saw her. When I finally left, it was with a promise to call the next morning. Of course I did so, and found her more charming than ever. Before long, it seemed that I only lived from one time of seeing her until the next. I was wildly, hopelessly in love, and though she was kindness itself to me, there was always an indescribable something in her manner that checked the words I would have liked it to utter. When I was away with her, I cursed myself for a fool, and braced up with all the rusty old saws about faint hearts and fair ladies, but when again in her presence the fear of what a refusal might mean tied my tongue. One night I escorted them to the opera. When we returned, it was late, but Jessie, as I always called her to myself, insisted that I should come in. She had been unusually full of spirits that evening, and her gay laughter and sallies of wit had completely enthralled me. Miss Ross said good night and discreetly left us at the library door. I had a now or never feeling that caused a peculiar sensation to perambulate up and down my spine. I thought the darkness of the room would be a favorable opportunity, but before I could take the slightest advantage of the situation, she turned a flood of gaslight upon the scene and gave me a tantalizing look that was too much for even my cowardice, and the next moment I had her in my arms, urging my suit with all her ardor. But she was obdurate. She broke away from my detaining grasp, tossing her wrap up upon a chair, cried gleefully, "So you say you love me? Very well. We will let fate decide it. I won you once, fair and square. Now see if you can win me. We will play a straight game, just as we did that night long ago. Only you shall take Joe's place. If you win, I am yours. If not, I remain single." She produced a pack of cards and a box of chips, seated herself at a small table, and motioned me to the opposite seat. There was nothing for me to do but obey. She divided the chips and, at a motion from me, dealt. Had long since mastered the intricacies of freeze-out, and though seldom a lucky player, I resolved to play as never man played before, for who ever played for such a stake? I had an odd feeling that she would keep her word and abide by the decision of the cards. We played in silence for a while, she getting the best of the game. I began to bet recklessly in hopes of retrieving my waning fortunes, but my luck was steadily against me. I fancied I saw a disconcerted look in her eyes when she saw my pile reduced to 5. I took heart at this and began to win. We were soon nearly even, when an idea took possession of me. On the next deal, I drew but one card. She took 3, and the betting began. I went slowly at first, but with a confident air that deceived her. I raised her till she had but 3 chips left. I calmly pushed in 3. She hesitated a moment, then threw down the cards. "Take it," she said. I quietly gathered in the chips, putting my bobtailed flush out of sight, and saw, as I gathered up the cards, that she had jacks and trays. With such odds in my favor, I began to feel very hopeful. I dealt. Each drew 2. She quietly laid down her last chip, and I, with throbbing heart, called hers. She had 3 queens and a pair of 8s. I threw down 4 trays and caught her in my arms, claiming her love as my reward. She assented with happiness in her eyes, but to this day, I have never told her what a bluff I played. This has been Luck by E.A. Thurston, published in Short Stories, a magazine of select fiction, Volume 13, 1892. Narrated by Conan Stewart for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.